Hello, my name is Madison Pesowski, and today I'll be talking about some work that was done in collaboration with Kelemen and Schachner, which shows that children use objects or artifacts to infer other shared interests. Let's begin by imagining a scenario where we're able to travel again and you're at a new place where you don't know anyone. Without even talking to them, you can make a lot of inferences about the people around you. And you can do this by considering the objects they own and have chosen to bring on their vacation. For instance, imagine seeing these objects each owned by a different person. From these objects, we can make inferences about the individual owners, and we can also make inferences about relationships between them. That is, we can infer who likely shares common interests, and we could even go a step further to infer who might even be friends. And we can make these inferences from these human-made objects or artifacts because they're more than just tools used for particular functions. They are also sources of social information. We know from previous work that adults intentionally use artifacts as social signals and actively choose and display certain artifacts to shape others' perceptions of them. Adults also use other people's artifacts to make quick and accurate judgments, such as a person's traits, interests, and social identities, just as you likely did in the example. And so given the important role that artifacts play in adult social reasoning, an interesting question, therefore, is how does this artifact-based social reasoning develop in childhood? In the current work, we explore children's ability to infer shared or common interests between other people from the artifacts they choose and own. This ability is important because children are often tasked with navigating novel social environments, such as the first day of school or playing at a new playground. Inferring common interests from other artifacts, then, could help children successfully initiate conversations with new social partners and allow them to understand relationships between peers. Findings from previous work suggest that several cognitive foundations of artifact-based social reasoning are in place in early childhood. Toddlers and preschoolers can infer ownership and understand that certain objects belong to certain people. They also use people's choices of objects to infer people's preferences, and they use objects to relate other people to themselves. For instance, children consider whether others share their preferences and use this information to guide their actions, such as deciding who to play with. But this previous work did not examine whether children use objects to reason about relationships between other people by inferring others' shared interests from the artifacts they choose and own. And more specifically, it remains unknown how children make these social inferences from physical objects. There are two types of cognitive processes that children might use to draw conclusions about people's shared interests from their artifacts. One possibility is that children may use perceptual similarity as a heuristic. Under this account, young children may pay attention to the perceptual similarity of objects and infer that owners of similar-looking objects are similar to one another, potentially ignoring other features of objects such as conceptual information. Since the work of Piaget, it's been argued that young children use heuristics in superficial features rather than engaging in deeper reasoning. And some research has even found that in some contexts, children initially prioritize perceptual features and shift towards conceptual information in the preschool years. For instance, in this example, if children use objects' perceptual similarity, then they should infer that the owners of the basketballs likely have shared interests. However, this account would lead to specific errors, especially when objects' conceptual information is pitted against perceptual cues. For instance, when seeing this group of people, children might infer that the owners of the teapot and the watering can are more likely to have shared interests than the person with the teacups, because the teapot and watering can are perceptually more similar. And this leads us to the other possibility, which is that children make inferences through explanation-based reasoning. Under this account, we consider multiple hypotheses to explain observed data, which in this case is why people own similar objects. And then we choose the hypothesis that offers the best explanation. So when seeing the two people who have the teapot and teacups, we might infer that they have similar artifacts because they both enjoy the activity the objects are used for, which in this case might be tea parties. And we would make the inference that they have shared interests even though the objects themselves look different. And it's possible that children might use this type of inferential reasoning because they do so in other related domains, including reasoning about others' mental states. To test these two accounts of children's reasoning, we introduced children to three characters, with a target character at the top and a toy each one had brought from home to play with after school. In each trial, we manipulated the conceptual similarity between the target's toy and the other character's toys and the sense of whether they were used for the same kind of activity, as well as the perceptual similarity between the toys. In half of the trials, the conceptual and perceptual cues were congruent. That is, one toy was both conceptually and perceptually more similar to the target's toy than the other. For instance, here the stack of books is both conceptually and perceptually similar to the books belonging to the target character. In the other half of trials, however, these cues were incongruent. In these trials, one toy was conceptually similar to the targets, while the other toy was perceptually more similar, meaning that it was of similar shape and color. For instance, here the xylophone is perceptually similar to the paint, but the paint brushes are conceptually more similar and that they're both used for the same activity. The idea is that if children use explanation-based reasoning and consider conceptual information to infer other shared interests, then they should infer that the character with a conceptually similar toy shares the target's preferences, even on incongruent trials where this toy is perceptually more distinct. And I just want to make a quick note that we asked a group of adults to judge which object was perceptually similar to the target's toy in each of the triads, and the findings validated the idea that the objects we deemed as perceptually similar actually looked most similar to the target's toy. That is, participants unanimously agreed that these items were perceptually similar in the congruent trials and did so 96% of the time in the incongruent trials, confirming, for instance, that the xylophone looked more similar to the paints than the paintbrushes. After seeing a triad of characters and their objects, children were then asked to make 2 inferences in each trial. One question always asked about relevant topics, such as which character liked the same games, same activities, or was best friends with the target. And the other question always asked about other irrelevant dimensions, such as which character had the same bedtime, birthday, or middle name as the target. And we asked these 2 types of questions to examine whether children make specific and warranted inferences about shared interests, or whether they overgeneralize and infer that people with similar artifacts are more similar on any given dimension. And I just want to quickly note that children had the option to say, "I don't know," or point to a shrugging character symbolizing that they didn't know the answer. Children were introduced to this option and what it meant before the study began, and this was given as an option to reduce frustration and keep engagement. If children responded to these questions by indicating one of the characters, they were then asked to explain their answer. So what makes you think that? In this study, we tested 4-year-olds, and we did so for a few main reasons. The first is that children at this age have a sophisticated understanding of the artifact domain, particularly about artifacts' intended functions. And second, as I said before, children's reasoning in other domains appears to be actively shifting from using perceptual features to conceptual information at this age. We also tested a group of adults to determine whether children's inferences resemble those of adults. We found evidence that children and adults make selective and warranted social inferences from objects. First, we'll look at adults' inferences on the congruent trials where one object was conceptually and perceptually more similar to the target's toy. Adults' responses to relevant questions, which included asking about shared interests, are on the left, and their responses to irrelevant questions are on the right. And what we see is that adults were more likely to select the character with a conceptually similar toy when asked relevant questions, and mostly said that they did not know in response to irrelevant ones, such as which character had the same birthday. And we found that children made similar inferences. Children also selected the character with a conceptually similar object more when asked about relevant topics like shared interests that could be inferred from objects. But when asked irrelevant questions, children did not systematically select either character and most often reported that they did not know. This shows that children don't infer that people with similar objects are similar on any given dimension, and they have a meta understanding that they can't make unwarranted social inferences from objects. We also found evidence suggesting that children use explanation-based reasoning rather than objects' perceptual similarity when making social inferences. Here are adults' and children's responses on incongruent trials where the conceptually similar object looked perceptually different. And what we see again is that both adults and children were more likely to select the character with a conceptually similar object when asked relevant than irrelevant questions. Though there was an interaction between trial type and question type, such that when answering relevant questions, children were a bit less likely to select the character with the conceptually similar toy in these cases, where the conceptual and perceptual cues were incongruent, than when they were congruent, as we saw in the previous slide. When looking at participants' responses to the different topics within the relevant and irrelevant questions, we found that children's and adults' inferences were mostly the same. For instance, both adults and children selected the character with the conceptually similar toy at equal rates when inferring who liked the same games and same activities as the target. But there was one potentially interesting developmental difference, which was that adults were more likely than children to infer that the character with the conceptually similar object was friends with the target. And we'll talk more about this later. Children's justifications for their responses also provided further evidence that children use explanation-based reasoning. Children's justifications for why they chose a particular character were coded into 4 non-mutually exclusive categories by 2 coders who were naive to the hypotheses and children's judgments. These categories were toy-based justifications, which referred to the toy's similarity, the toys themselves, or stated that the characters like or would engage in the activity the toys were for. For instance, the justification that they both have things for tea. Character-based explanations were those that appealed to the character's physical features, such as their faces, and these explanations were not considered to be justified since the characters were counterbalanced. The third category was responses where children said, "I don't know," and expressed their uncertainty, and the other category encompassed justifications that were irrelevant, ambiguous, or just restated the question. And as you can see in the graph, children were more likely to provide toy-based explanations when answering relevant questions than irrelevant ones, suggesting that they actively and selectively used objects' conceptual information to infer other shared interests. They were also more likely to say that they did not know why they selected a character when answering irrelevant questions than relevant ones. Together, these findings show that children and adults consider the conceptual similarity of objects when inferring other shared interests. That is, children infer that individuals with conceptually similar objects or objects that are used for the same activity are more likely to have the same interests. And this is the case even when someone else has an object that's perceptually more similar. This means that children are able to use relevant information over irrelevant surface features and provides evidence that children use explanation-based reasoning rather than simple perceptual heuristics. These findings contrast with earlier theoretical accounts suggesting that children's reasoning is superficial in nature, but are in line with other accounts providing evidence of deeper conceptual reasoning in childhood. Though I should note that there was some effect of perceptual similarity and that children's responses were more consistent when perceptual and conceptual cues were congruent. Importantly, these findings contribute to the current literature by showing that by age 4, children's cognitive ability to prioritize conceptual over perceptual information extends to the domain of artifact-based social reasoning. It also shows that 4-year-olds use the artifacts people own and choose to make selective and warranted social inferences. That is, children don't infer that people with similar objects are similar on every dimension. Instead, when asked which people had the same arbitrary properties, such as the same bedtime, birthday, or middle name, children did not systematically select either character and most often reported that they didn't know. As I noted, we found one interesting developmental difference, which is that children, unlike adults, did not infer that 2 people with conceptually similar artifacts were best friends, despite inferring that they had shared interests. This contrasts with previous research showing that children believe that shared preferences are one of the most important characteristics of friendships. It's possible that children didn't infer friendship in our study for a few reasons. The first could be due to the question itself. So we asked children to identify the best friend, a type of friendship for which additional evidence may be required. Second, 4-year-olds may need a greater quantity of evidence to infer friendship. For instance, they may need evidence that 2 people have many similar toys before they can infer friendship. And third, children in the current study might not have believed that people's shared preferences for an activity would necessarily cause them to consistently play together, which is an important feature of friendship for children. One potential direction for future work could be to explore artifact-based social reasoning in children with autism spectrum disorder. Individuals with ASD typically experience fewer reciprocal friendships and lower peer acceptance, and so it could be informative to explore whether children with ASD fail to spontaneously infer others' interests from their artifacts, since, as I mentioned before, this ability could help children successfully initiate conversations with new social partners and allow them to understand relationships between peers. Further, in future work, we want to explore how children reason about the informativity of people's choices and how an object was chosen. For instance, whether children consider the variability of a set of objects from which an object was chosen from. As an example, a person's choice of this teapot is more indicative of their preferences and interests if it was chosen from this set of variable objects rather than this one. And this is because the set of objects on the right is more constrained. So we can't be sure that the person's choice of the teapot truly reflects their preferences. Perhaps they would have chosen something different if they were presented with a more variable set of options. Recent work in our lab has shown that this reasoning is present in adults, and we're excited to explore this with children in our lab in the future. For now, I would like to thank our participants, our research assistants, funding sources, and of course you for listening. Thank you.